It is always a pleasure to be joined on Sports Not by Aaron Freeman. He has been covering the Atlanta Falcons for, I'm going to say, the better part of 2 decades, 15 years maybe to be specific, and has his very popular Locked On Falcons podcast as well, which is a deep dive into everything for the Falcons diehards that might be tuning in. Hey, Aaron, how's it going?
I'm doing great. How's it going with you?
It's going good. You know, I was listening to a couple episodes of Locked On Falcons, and I noticed that you have really taken a deep dive into some of these second and third round draft picks that the Falcons have picked up. Why don't we start with your most recent episode and your assessment of Troy Andersen and whether or not he could potentially quarterback the defense? How do you assess a player like the one that they just got in Troy Andersen?
Yeah, I think Andersen's an interesting prospect because he brings a lot of the similar traits that the Falcons have had in a player like Deion Jones these last couple of years. And kind of the expectation is that Deion Jones is going to be moved on from maybe as early as next week after June 1st. And certainly I think the Falcons are looking at a guy like Troy Andersen as the guy that can be sort of their long-term middle linebacker, which was the role that was filled by Deion Jones for a number of years under the previous coaching staff. And like Jones, Andersen brings speed and coverage ability to the table. There are some question marks similar to Jones about his ability to be a run defender, but Troy Andersen's a really smart, athletic guy. And one of the things I noted in my detailed breakdown of Troy Andersen, when you go back to his record going back to high school, you know, he's excelled at pretty much everything he did. He was a high school valedictorian. He was a 2-time track state champion, winds up, going to Montana State and getting that team to a national title before he ultimately leaves there. So he's had a lot of success, at lower levels of competition, and it'll be interesting to see if he can sort of carry that over to the next level and kind of be the face of the Falcons defense at that middle linebacker spot for years to come.
You mentioned his physical gifts and the intangibles that he has outside of some of the question marks. Is there a chance with how successful he's been over the course of his career to date that you might see him provide some kind of versatility on both sides of the ball? Or do you really see him kind of sinking into that middle linebacker role and being the guy, as you said, for them on defense to kind of quarterback this thing for the next couple of seasons?
Well, I think the Falcons definitely drafted him to be the quarterback of their defense, but I wouldn't be shocked if down the road, once he gets comfortable in that role, if the Falcons dabbled with him maybe as a red zone threat, that was a role that we saw Mike Vrabel do in New England many, many years ago. Mike Vrabel, of course, the head coach of the Tennessee Titans now, also very close with former Tennessee Titans offensive coordinator, now head coach Arthur Smith. So I think I could imagine a scenario where a couple of years from now, once Troy Andersen sort of established himself as, sort of a starting linebacker, that the Falcons in red zone situations could use a guy that's 6'4", 240 pounds, similar size to what you see in modern NFL tight ends, sort of in red zone situations, give you a couple of gadget plays, those types of things. And he might wind up having a couple of touchdown catches over the course of his career, but primarily I think his role is going to be on defense.
You mentioned Arthur Smith. One of the questions that's looming over the organization heading into next season is whether or not the Falcons have done enough to avoid essentially tanking the 2022 season. I mean, people have said that tongue in cheek. I know you sent a couple tweets out with a little bit of shredded truth to them maybe, but also a little bit of tongue in cheek. I mean, in all seriousness, have they done enough to avoid tanking?
I think it's obviously no NFL team, at least we believe, is purposely trying to lose games. I don't think the Falcons are purposely trying to lose games, but I think it is fair to question maybe some of the roster moves that they've made so far this offseason, if they are necessarily have done maybe the utmost to put forth the most competitive roster, particularly when it comes to what was the biggest weakness of the team the last season, which was in the trenches along the offensive and defensive line. They've made gains. They've made improvements there. They've brought in competition on the offensive line. They brought in a couple of young pass rushers on the defensive line. But you still feel like there's a lot of work to be done. And again, of course, the offseason isn't over. There will probably be roster moves, in the next week or two after June 1st, ahead of training camp. And of course, there'll be other opportunities for the Falcons once cuts are made in August to pick up some guys off the waiver wire. So I don't want to sit here and say that the Falcons are done with their offseason, but it does feel like the Falcons are hinging a lot on, just the coach's ability to improve the offensive and defensive lines rather than bringing in new talent at those positions. And it does make me kind of wonder a little bit if the Falcons have put their best foot forward to be the best possible team this upcoming season. And it's kind of this balancing act of you want to be the best team, you want to establish your culture and winning culture at the same time. But if you're the Falcons, you can at least make an argument, given that quarterbacks are very important to your success. And if the Falcons were to have a high pick next year, maybe it wouldn't be so bad because they might have an opportunity to get a quarterback. Obviously, they're hoping that Desmond Ridder is their long-term answer at that position. But obviously, with the departure of Matt Ryan, guy that had been the stabilizing force at that position for the better part of 2 decades, you kind of are left in limbo, I think you can say, at that point in time. And so it's kind of, to borrow a phrase used by general manager Terry Fontenot earlier this offseason, the Falcons want to have their cake and eat it too, which he was referencing their ability to rebuild their roster, but also be competitive right away. And it feels like the Falcons have made gains, but not so many gains where it feels like they're going to be out of the mix for a high pick next year. So I kind of liken it to having your cake and eat it too, being able to establish, a better winning culture, but also not ruining your chances to get a potential franchise quarterback or a franchise player at another position if they deem the quarterback situation is solved with Desmond Ridder.
I do want to ask you about Desmond Ridder and how ready he is for the NFL, but just to punctuate this last line of thinking about what we're going to see this next season, how much faith should Falcons fans have in the coaching staff that's currently constituted to be able to work with what they have and deliver results that are different from the ones that we've seen?
I think Falcon fans should be optimistic. I think this season we'll get a real opportunity to see how good a coaching staff the Falcons have. I think last year was not a great opportunity for this coaching staff to put their best foot forward. There were some issues with the team and the roster. And now I think they're looking at a roster that is much more their construction. And so I think we'll be able to find out if this coaching staff can really maximize the talent on the roster. That was a major knock on the team a year ago, which were concerns about, is this roster talented enough? And I think the perception is the Falcons winning 7 games was overachievement. But I think when you kind of look at that a little deeper, you look at some of the games that they won, they were facing one of the softer schedules in the NFL a year ago. I believe the 4th easiest schedule based off of last year's records. This year, going into this season, it's currently the 9th hardest schedule in the NFL based off of last year's records. And we'll obviously see how that changes with teams' performances this upcoming season. But I think this year you'll be able to tell if this coaching staff can get more out of the talent level and whether or not the Falcons can be much more competitive against some of the better teams that they're going to face this season. Because a year ago, they were not particularly competitive against quality opponents and mostly were able to rack up some wins against some of the lesser teams in the NFL. And they won't necessarily have as many teams on their schedule this year that you could describe as such. So I think this year is going to be a great litmus test to sort of see whether or not this coaching staff is capable of elevating this roster to higher levels.
And while we're litmus testing here, I mean, how ready is Desmond Ridder to potentially contribute?
The buzz right now is positive. I mean, we're barely into the offseason and OTAs, and we just had rookie minicamp, and the Falcons are beginning that thing right now. But I think so far he's checking all the boxes that you want him to check. He's showing poise, he's showing leadership, he's showing maturity. That's kind of what you need to see from a young quarterback, particularly going into training camp. And there is going to be probably a legit competition between him and Marcus Mariota. The expectation from myself and most other people is that Mariota will win that competition and start the season week 1. But I sit here and, I'm pulling numbers out of my butt when I say this, but I think there's a 30% chance that Desmond Ridder could wind up, stealing the starting job from Marcus Mariota at this point in time. And that number could grow. That number could shrink over the coming weeks as the Falcons, work through these OTAs and see that Desmond Ridder is a little bit mature, is more mature than expected, is grasping the offense at a higher rate and faster rate than expected, and could come into training camp and really challenge Marcus Mariota for that week 1 starting job. But I do think the expectation, at least if not week 1, we will see Desmond Ridder starting games at some point this season for the Falcons, probably closer to the middle point or latter half of the season, to allow him time to get his feet wet. But I think in terms of that, I feel confident that Desmond Ridder has shown so far that he's ready to start games this season. It's just a question of how early he's going to be ready to start games. And we haven't quite reached a level yet to say that he's ready to be a week 1 starter. That will obviously be unpacked and unfolded in August in training camp. But so far, so good.
I think one of the biggest questions that Falcons fans have, at least the ones that I've spoken with, is still around Mariota and what he's going to be able to do. You mentioned Desmond Ridder potentially coming in as early as next season and spelling him for a couple of games, and that starting position is up for grabs. What do the Falcons need to see from Marcus Mariota? Where does he need to get better? And what do you predict for what they're going to do offensively next season in order to give him the best chance to get comfortable and succeed?
It's interesting because doing more and more research on Marcus Mariota, you hear certain things about him, like he wasn't necessarily a great practice player towards the end of his time in Tennessee. And that makes me think of things that the main reason why he continued to be a starter for the Titans is because they invested, that premium draft pick, that number 2 overall selection, that 2015 draft. And then I know from reading various, beat writers that cover the Raiders the last couple of years, it wasn't as if Mariota was really lighting it up in practice there. And some of that is owed to the fact that he was a little nicked up in some of those training camps. And so part of me wonders if that's the carryover into Atlanta. Is he going to kind of be middling, I guess you could say, in training camp if that continues this summer? And does that, open the door further for a guy like Desmond Ridder to sort of swoop in and steal a job? But I think in terms of what the expectations are for Mariota, I don't think anybody has too many, or there's not many people that think Mariota is the long-term answer. He's just kind of a guy that can get you through this season, keep the spot warm, give Desmond Ridder time to, sort of to get up to speed in the NFL, and keep the team competitive. I think that's the main thing with Mariota, his ability to make plays with his legs as well as his arm, his experience in the offense, running the offense, his familiarity with Arthur Smith from their shared days at Tennessee, I think gives Mariota a leg up to at least get the team to competency so that you can better evaluate some of these other players, particularly some of the weapons they have now, drafting Drake London, Kyle Pitts a year ago, trading for Bryan Edwards. So you get an opportunity to get a competent NFL caliber starter with some of these young wide receivers to see what you have with those guys as well. And so I think that's really, Mariota is really an opportunity for you to evaluate some of your young weapons.
And logic would suggest maybe that in today's NFL, which is a complete pressure cooker, not having the expectation of being a first-round draft pick or the guy who's going to be, the long-term solution that everybody's invested in might benefit Marcus Mariota if he is familiar with what Arthur Smith is trying to do. Is there a world in which he surprises some people and has found his fit and will exceed expectations?
Yeah, I think in a vacuum, Marcus Mariota checks a lot of the boxes that you're looking for. If you want to call him a reclamation project, it's that former first-round pick that can get his career back on track. We saw, a similar dynamic with Ryan Tannehill going to Tennessee after several years in Miami and blossoming there and taking Marcus Mariota's job. And I think Mariota's kind of looking for an opportunity to sort of do that in Atlanta. Obviously, he's not stealing a job from anybody, but I think this is a golden opportunity for Marcus Mariota to get his career back on track after spending 2 years as a reserve to Derek Carr with the Las Vegas Raiders, and show people that, while it didn't end well for him in Tennessee, this is a guy that can still be a capable starter. So I think the door is certainly, cracked a little bit for Marcus Mariota to come in here and press and get this Falcons team playing, at a playoff caliber, being very competitive against some of the tougher teams that they face in the early part of the season. They're facing the Saints, they're facing the Bucs, teams like the Browns and the Rams, et cetera, are some of these teams in the first half of the season that the Falcons are going to face. And should Mariota come out and impress and play well and go toe-to-toe with the likes of Matt Stafford and Tom Brady and some of these other quarterbacks, I think that will be a promising sign for his long-term future. But I don't necessarily know if the Falcons are really in a situation where they are planning to move forward long-term with Marcus Mariota. I feel like it's either Desmond Ridder in terms of their long-term future, or a quarterback that's currently not on the roster and probably playing college football as we speak, is sort of their long-term option. But I think Mariota has an opportunity to showcase that he can be more than just a bridge quarterback here in Atlanta and be a long-term starter, if not here in Atlanta, somewhere else.
You mentioned that the offseason isn't completely finished, but that the Falcons still have some significant work to do, and just in terms of adding to some positions that have been not as productive in the past. I mean, as you kind of assess the roster right now, which positions do you think the Falcons need to address before the offseason wraps up?
Well, I think the two problem areas that you have right now is on the offensive and defensive line. I think the offensive line, you're looking at maybe bringing maybe a veteran at the left guard position where, 2021 third round pick Jalen Mayfield really struggled a year ago. They did draft another left guard in the 6th round in Justin Schaefer this past year. So he adds some competition there, but I think you would like to have a veteran there that you can sort of, enhance that competition. And then I think on the defensive line, I think they just need to get a little bit more size at that position. They didn't really draft anybody. They didn't really sign anybody to the interior defensive line other than Vincent Taylor. Getting another nose tackle, getting another defensive lineman makes a ton of sense. Players that we brought up a ton of times on Locked On Falcons over the last couple of weeks is Akeem Hicks and Eddie Goldman, two former Chicago Bears. The Falcons have brought in a bunch of ex-Bears this offseason. And so it seems like if they want to continue down that path, those two guys make a ton of sense to beef up their defensive line. Brandon Williams, a former Ravens who played under Falcons defensive coordinator Dean Pease, when their shared time there, makes a ton of sense as a potential nose tackle stopgap option there. So, I think some veteran players along the interior of the defensive line and interior of the offensive line could go a long way to sort of mitigating some of the concerns that you have going into the season.
Aaron Freeman telling it like it is. Locked On Falcons absolutely must listen and must watch on YouTube for anybody who is diehard Falcons and wants to know what to expect next season. Thanks as always for being with me, Aaron. It's great to talk to you.
Always enjoy it.